Good morning. I'm Carol Bastille. I'm the Dean of the Maryland Fulton Teachers College. We are thrilled to have this group here. I've been using and talking cage busting now for a long time, and education entrepreneurship and all these kinds of things that he's been writing about now for I don't know how long time. It all has just made a lot of sense to me. That as we think about where education is headed and where we want to go and how we begin thinking about the education workforce and who teachers are and how do we deal with what I think is becoming a very untenable job. How do we think differently about that and what schools look like and how we deploy people and entrepreneurship and all those kinds of things that we've been talking about in the college since I started here in August. A lot of that comes from a lot of what I've gleaned from Rick and attending meetings with him and his K-12 working group and just a phenomenal group of people that he brings together and is always thinking and always partnering and always trying to figure out how to bring people together. You all can read the bio. I don't have to tell you all about it. And you're not here to listen to me, so it's all yours.
Thanks, Carol. Hey, it's great to be here with you guys. I was saying, I can't remember the last time I was in Arizona. It's been at least years and years, so great to be out with you guys. It's a beautiful day, and any chance to get away from the Beltway, especially these days, is a huge plus. So I'm out chatting today. I've got a book that comes out officially later this week, as a matter of fact. It's called Letters to a Young Education Reformer, out with Harvard Ed Press. And if you don't mind, I'm going to talk at you for about 25 minutes about it, and then we can have a conversation about whatever you like. We can talk about goings-on in Washington, or we can talk about things I said that you find misguided or wrong-headed, which is my general experience in life, or what have you. I wrote this book because a couple of years ago, I was watching many of my good friends get frustrated that some of their ambitious reform efforts seem not to be playing out the way they'd hoped. Every Student Succeeds Act basically unrolled a lot of what folks had tried to do with No Child Left Behind. The Common Core was playing out very differently than had been first anticipated. And it all felt to me frighteningly familiar, frighteningly kind of, predictable. And I was trying to figure out why that was and how to make any sense of it. Because I realized I've been doing this work for a quarter century. Started out substitute teaching for beer money in college back in the late 1980s. Got my teacher credential in the Harvard Graduate School of Ed, taught high school down in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And I've been doing this stuff ever since. And I was trying to think, is there anything I've actually learned in all this time? Because I generally am a slow learner, so I wasn't sure. Anyway, so I started writing a series of essays, letters, 21 of them on things like the role of philanthropy and how to think about research and the respective roles, the role of policy and what it can and can't do. Anyway, there's 21 of these letters, and they added up to this book. But I don't want to walk you through the whole thing today, because that would seem unduly tedious. So what I do want to talk to you about is a couple things that I think I've taken away over time. But let me start here. It was 2002. I'm in my office at AEI in Washington, and I get a call from the Pentagon. And they say, hey, we want you to come to a secret meeting at the Pentagon. We can't tell you anything about it. When you get here, you got to sign a non-disclosure form. Will you make it over? And I was like, hell yeah, that sounds fascinating, right? So I get over there, and it turns out that we are planning to invade Iraq, and they need teams that are going to go support the different ministries of the Iraqi government. And they wanted me to be part of this 4-person team that would go over for 6 months to support the education ministry. And so I went to a couple of meetings before I ultimately decided this wasn't for me, but there was 4 of us who were going to be on the team. There were a few folks from the Pentagon, a few folks from the White House. There is one memory from this that's indelibly stuck in my head. It was probably the second gathering. Very nice young woman from the White House puts her hand down and says, this all sounds terrific. We're so excited. Just want to remind everybody that the White House, the president, really has one priority here, and it's that when we leave Iraq, we just want to make sure they have their version of No Child Left Behind. We didn't know if schools were going to be standing up or were going to be rubble. We didn't know how many kids were going to be dispossessed or injured. They hadn't realized I was Jewish, and they wanted me to go oversee the Ministry of Ed in Iraq. But by God, they knew that No Child Left Behind was what Iraq needed. And it was just kind of strange to me, because I'm not sure that we needed No Child Left Behind, but we were sure that they needed it. And the funny thing is what was striking to me about this was not that it was atypical, not that it was unusual that the folks at the White House had fallen in love with their big reform idea. What was striking to me was how typical it was of my career in education. That people have this habit of falling in love with their big idea, whatever that idea is, deciding that that's the solution to our educational woes, and then pushing it with enthusiasm for 3 years until they decide that there's a new solution, and they push that. And then they get bored and they go work for a foundation. Now, part of this is the product that so many people come into education, I think, not necessarily because they think education, because they're fascinated by the stuff of teaching and learning, and by wanting school to be an experience that's useful and valuable and energizing, but because they see schools as a place to tackle larger social ills. They want to tackle inequity or poverty. And that's great. I respect the hell out of that. But it's interesting that when you treat schools as a black box because you're focused on larger social purposes, it's easy, I think, at times to have blind spots about how reform actually plays out in the real world of schools. So let me just say a word about why I got into school reform. I got into school reform because as a kid I hated school. I mean, I was picked on and bullied and all that stuff, but a lot of us have been there. But I just mean that, like, for me, my childhood experience of school was going in and watching minutes on the clock tick away until we could get to 2:30, so I could go home and do something else. Now, it was weird, because a lot of what I wanted to get home to was the stuff we could be doing in school. I like to read. I grew up, spent middle school and high school years in Fairfax County, Virginia. I went to good public schools all through my life, including the Fairfax County schools, which are nationally respected. I like to read the Washington Post cover to cover. But as soon as I was in school, things that were otherwise interesting or pleasant became anything but. Now, not every minute of every year in school was like that. There were teachers, there were classes where my experience was very different. Right? We all have that kind of dichotomy. For me, the one that sticks in mind was my 6th grade teacher, Selma Ziff at Pine Ridge Elementary. Selma Ziff managed to take stuff like long algebra and complex multiplication problems and actually make them interesting to a bunch of 6th graders. We would like race into that room each morning and do our math fundamentals for 2 minutes before the day got started, because it was in the execution, it was in the delivery, it was in the way that she had created a culture around this stuff that actually appealed to a bunch of 6th graders. The next year I hated math again. When I finished high school and went to the one college that took me and started to do well in school, I realized that actually I didn't hate school at all, that I hated the way my school experience in K-12 had played out. And I realized that I was not unusual in this. When you talk to people, whether they have gone to good schools or lousy schools, high poverty schools or low poverty schools, this is most people's experience of schooling. Large parts of it actually add nothing to their quality of life. Large parts of it are a chunk of their childhood. 1,000 hours a year for 12 years, wasted and burned for no obvious reason. And the striking thing is it's not just, I got a 3-year-old and a 6-month-old home, and I don't want them to have to suffer through that, but it's not just that. It's that even today, decades later, the things that I understand, the intuitions I have, I frequently can trace back to something that I understood or got in one of those classrooms when I was 6 or 16 that connected with me at a time when my brain was still very much malleable. For me, that's what education reform is about. Education reform is about figuring out how do we make schools and classrooms that actually speak to kids, that cultivate character, that create citizens, that teach them skills and knowledge that are useful and energizing and that fire their imagination. And when we talk about reform in ways that drifts from that, it doesn't actually feel like reform anymore. It feels like we've actually lost sight of where we're trying to go. Now, it's funny. When I went down, I finished college, I got my teaching credential, I went down to Baton Rouge to teach high school social studies, and I realized I wanted to try to create this kind of classroom for the kids, the kinds that had made a difference for me, and I failed miserably. And I failed miserably partly because it was on me, but also I realized that schools were not configured to help me do the kinds of things I wanted to do for kids. I taught 160 kids a day. I used to teach with Carol Tomlinson at the University of Virginia. I'm a big fan of differentiation. I think it makes sense. I'll tell you what, at least for me, it was really difficult to figure out how do you differentiate around 160 students. How do you get to know them? How do you understand what they need? How do you design appropriate supports and interventions? Beyond my skill. I wanted to have my kids do a lot of writing. Kids didn't do a lot of writing in the East Baton Rouge Parish School System. I wanted them to write 10 pagers once a quarter because it was social studies and there was cool stuff to write about. I didn't do the math that when you assigned 160 kids 10 pages, that you are pretty much locked up in your apartment grading papers for the next 4 weeks. It seemed like there were strategies that would actually allow us to give kids writing without punishing the teachers for actually doing so. But schools weren't interested in this. In fact, at the time we were pioneering, the big reform at the moment was a 137-item checklist dreamed up by a graduate of Harvard that we were going to use to determine who was a good and bad teacher in Baton Rouge. It lasted 18 months and then faded away forever. I got frustrated. Because I get frustrated, I don't have this kind of appetite for staying and doing the right thing. I said, hell with it. I went back. I went to do my PhD at Harvard and try to understand why schools looked the way they did and why the reforms didn't seem to speak to the frustrations that I and my colleagues experienced. National Science Foundation gave me a chunk of money to do a study to try to figure out why districts chose the reforms they did. I looked at 57 urban systems, and it turns out I couldn't actually do the reform that I was given this money to do. Because over the 57 districts I was looking at, every district was doing every single reform that I was trying to study. In the 3-year period, average district had launched 11 major reforms. That's one every 3 months. If you've ever worked in an organization like that, and if you've worked in schools, you probably have, you know that there's only one rational response, is you close your door and you tell each other, this too shall pass. Because when you were naive enough and young enough to actually take the reform seriously in your second year, and you spent 4 weeks of your summer devising your new instructional lesson plans around the new math curriculum, because you were promised that this would be there forever, and then the new superintendent flushed it next year, you're like, that's 4 weeks of my summer I never get back. So you learn not to take any of this stuff at face value. That is how reform gets experienced in schools and systems, right? It frequently gets experienced as a series of raindrops pelting on the tin roof of the school. It's ignored, it's wished away, and teachers would close their door and they retreat to the four corners of the classroom and they do their thing. Now, for me, if you think that school reform is actually about helping teachers do their stuff better, make those thousands of subtle judgments that actually distinguish between good classrooms and bad classrooms, form those coherent cultures that characterize good schools, this is the worst possible place to go. What you actually want are teachers who are eagerly taking responsibility for how their schools work, who are invested in professional judgment, and who say, hold me responsible for whether or not this stuff is working for kids. Instead, you have teachers who are trying to duck, stay out of the way, not be voluntold what to do, and just basically not run afoul of any problems. We've created a world, basically, that is where reform becomes a negative for teachers and reform becomes a negative for reformers. It becomes a negative for teachers because teachers have learned to treat reform as a constant condition not to be taken seriously. This means that no reforms actually work. When the new superintendent comes in, does the August introduction for the new set of standards or for the new teacher evaluation system, talks about the research base, talks about how we're going to do this carefully and seriously, most teachers kind of, laugh to one another quietly behind their hands. When teachers go to professional learning communities and are told that these are important and integral to the school improvement effort, most teachers show up late, bring their grade book, and don't pay a lot of attention. That's actually not the biggest problem, though. The biggest problem is for reformers. You guys know how in the health professions we worry about overprescription of antibiotics because we create these drug-resistant superbugs, right? We've created reform-resistant schools. This level of cynicism and skepticism means that reforms tend not to get taken seriously, which means people don't do the things you need to do to make them work, which means that the reforms don't work. So then we say, well, the next reform, we got to go bigger and badder and really push it in. And the teachers close their doors even more firmly. And what happens is each reform that doesn't work and then doesn't stick actually creates a deeper level of skepticism. So failed reforms are not just a waste of time, they actually make it even less likely that the next effort's going to work. Now, faced with this, reformers have said, well, we've got to go bigger and badder. No Child Left Behind didn't do it. Common Core didn't do it. Teacher evaluation systems didn't do it. So now we got to, we're going to do early childhood. We're going to get it earlier. We're going to revisit career and technical ed. So we're going to keep moving on to new, fresh opportunity to make the system change. And teachers experience this as a series of attacks from people who don't really get it and don't understand. And so they dig in. And so reformers get ever more frustrated that teachers don't get it and are part of the problem. And teachers feel like this is a war on their profession. And you get to where we stand today. So what do we do about any of this? So in the book, I talk about 5 things I think I've learned that can maybe help. First is that we've got to fundamentally get better at the relationship between talkers and doers. Talkers are people who work at universities and think tanks and in legislative jobs. They don't actually do schools or schooling, they talk about it. We write papers and give talks and write legislation. Then there's the doers. The doers are the people who are in schools and classrooms. If we're talking about criminal justice, they're the cops who actually have to walk the street. Turns out that the people who actually do the job know a lot of stuff that people who talk about it and only fly by find it hard to know. They see exactly how this new teacher evaluation system is working on the ground. They tend to think in terms of kids and instructional units and whether or not there's noise in the hallway after the bell rings. This makes doers the best possible source of insight into how reform works. However, doers also have real limitations. They tend to get myopic. When you go to the same place of work 190 days a year, and you're with the same people and the same kids every day, that is the world as you experience it. That's what you know. Doers tend to get defensive. When one is being critical of what's going on, they tend to take it very personally because they feel like you're criticizing the job they're doing. Doers have less time to read analyses and white papers and studies about different educational interventions because they're doing a day job all day. So talkers actually have a real role to play. Talkers have lots of time to visit and listen to lots of people doing lots of kind of work. We have time to read and write. Problem is, when you're a talker, it's easy to forget that there's a healthy dialectic here. Because the people who get to write op-eds, the people who show up on radio and TV, the people who get invited to fancy universities to give nice talks to groups like you guys, are the talkers. It's very easy to get very full of yourself. When you're a teacher, your mom calls and says, honey, don't you want to do something more? When you get to write an op-ed or show up on radio, your mom calls and says, I heard you on the radio. It tends to give talkers, especially 27-year-old advocates, a very inflated sense of their place in the world. The doers, rather than becoming essential partners, become the people who aren't doing the big idea right. Now, talkers will frequently say, but I used to teach. I taught once, which is a lot like when your typical 9th grade teacher says, I was a kid once. It doesn't actually do a lot to forge a connection with the kids. They go, yeah, once upon a time you were. You don't see the world the way we see it anymore. So reformers have, I think, lost the ability in various ways to remember the importance of that relationships, and we've got to rediscover it. Second thing I think I've learned is that policy is a much more limited tool of school improvement than we'd like it to be. Policy is good at 2 things. It's good at making people do something and making people not do something. So if you want to build a new school, or if you want to make sure classes have no more than 25 kids, policy is great. On the other hand, much of what we talk about as school reform, what matters is how you do it rather than whether you do it. When we're talking about introducing new standards, when we're talking about school improvement strategies, when we're talking about teacher evaluation, it turns out that the doing it is not the hard part. Doing it in a way that actually matters for kids is the hard part. This is not an unusual insight. 30 years ago, folks in Washington were concerned that planes were too often arriving after their scheduled arrival time. So they wanted to create an on-time arrival scorecard so that all of us could know which airlines were on time or not. Perfectly smart idea, just transparency, let us all have good information. Airlines mostly responded by doing two distinct things. One, they started boarding people on planes much earlier in the process so they could get them out on the tarmac, so they could get them in the queue. And the second thing they did was they pushed back the arrival times. And the funny thing is when you push back an arrival time, air traffic control then says, oh, we have more time to get the plane to its destination. So they go ahead and choose a more air traffic control friendly, slower route. The result of this sensible effort to make sure we knew if planes were on time was that 10 years later, Americans were spending tens of millions more hours a year sitting on planes. Same thing plays out in education repeatedly. Many of you in the room will remember that a decade ago, the New Teacher Project wrote the Widget Effect, pointed out that in districts across the land where large numbers of kids weren't doing as well as we'd like, 99% of teachers were consistently rated effective, even when nobody thought that was the honest number. So there was an enormous effort to get much more rigorous about teacher evaluation. In Colorado, it was Senate Bill 191. We were calling for structured observational protocols using Marzano or Danielson. We were going to use student growth scores. We were going to use student learning objectives. Tens of millions of dollars were spent. Tens of thousands of observations were conducted. They released the results of the new evaluation system, and they found that 1% of teachers are rated ineffective. What happened? This was actually the national norm. Matt Kraft did a terrific paper out of Brown University last year, pointed out that principals still don't want to be mean, so they do more observations under state mandate, but it's not their culture. And even if principals give teachers negative evals, they're not confident those teachers will actually be removed. So what happens is all of this effort, all of this policy fury wound up bumping into the shoals of practical reality. Now, when things don't work, what happens is those of us who design these reforms, the talkers, tend to say there was an implementation problem. An implementation problem is a nice way of saying we don't know what the hell they're doing, it's your fault. It's a way that talkers blame the doers when ideas don't work. And doers take this as an attack, and we're back to what I was talking about a moment ago. The third thing I've learned is that experts and expertise need to be used much more carefully than we usually do. Now, don't misunderstand me. This is the age of Trump, and so expertise. But I mean it this way. If I'm going to the dentist, I want somebody who's expert at reading an x-ray, at using a drill, and at filling a cavity. If I'm taking my child in for a special needs diagnostic, I want a special educator who's expert at diagnoses and expert at designing interventions. But notice what I'm talking about. I'm talking about applying a specific kind of expertise to a particular need. That's not what we're talking about when we're talking about school reform. Think about that teacher evaluation stuff. Who's an expert in that? Well, there are experts in designing high-quality assessments to measure learning. There are experts in the psychometric properties of these assessments, especially in terms of reliability and validity. We're trying to use them to judge individual instructors. There are experts in using the Danielson or Marzano frameworks. There are different experts in training lots of people to use those frameworks. There are experts in how do you write state legislation in ways that you are more likely to get faithful adoption in school districts. By the time you get through the process of any of the things we usually talk about as reform, you realize there's 15 or 20 distinct kinds of expertise involved. Nobody's expert in all of it, but somebody gets to call the shots and be the go-to. So what happens is when we start talking about a reform initiative, a game of musical chairs ensues. All of the people with possible expertise start knocking on the door of the Gates Foundation, or they start trying to get a meeting with the governor's special assistant for education. And they try to show that it's American Idol, that they are the expert who ought to be entrusted with this pet idea. And if they win, they then get to bring in other people to help them with it. But that pretty much guarantees that any big reform is going to be designed by somebody who is an expert in 5% of it and is making stuff on the fly about the other 95%. Now, this is human nature. I always remember I was in South Korea years ago, probably 10, 12 years ago, for the State Department. Spent a week and a half traveling the country, talking to colleges and leadership groups. And I remember we did one thing at the Ministry of Education. I was the American expert, so they had the Korean TV, South Korean TV, and newspapers, and they were asking questions about, what's the American expert think about this and that. And one question was, you're an expert, and as an expert, what can South Korea learn from American higher education? I don't know. I don't know anything about South Korean higher education, so I was just making stuff up. So I'm rambling, and I hit upon a point. I'm like, well, in the U.S., we wind up having our higher ed system is enormously geographically spread. Go across this country, you will find major universities or small colleges in towns across the land. These become hubs for economic growth and entrepreneurship and human talent. South Korea could learn from that. Next morning, my translator comes to the hotel, picks me up. She's got whatever the major paper was. I'm on like page 5. There's my mugshot and like a big article in Korean. And she said, we have to go back to the ministry. And I'm like, what's up? She said, well, turns out, which I hadn't known because I know nothing about South Korean higher ed, that about 6 months before, the Ministry of Education had released its new 10-year strategic plan for higher ed, and it all focused on investments in the major universities, which are all clustered in Seoul. And so the story was how the American expert attacked the South Korean 10-year strategic plan and said that the ministry didn't know what it was doing. The perils of not knowing what you're talking about. So we go over to the ministry, and we sat down, and we averted an international incident over the vagaries of higher ed reform, which was good. But here's the funny thing. The funny thing is, in the back of that car, while I'm getting driven over to the administration, I'm thinking, they're crazy not to listen to me. That's a damn good idea. I don't know what I was talking about. I was making up on the fly. But we get invested in our ideas. Those of you who are grad students, if you've ever written a term paper, by the time you've written 15 pages on this, you convince yourself you believe it, even if you'd never heard of it 6 weeks prior. Think about people who've studied site-based management or block scheduling for a year or 5 years. When somebody says, hey, should we think about doing 8th grade algebra? You're not an unbiased expert talking about the challenge. You are a cheerleader for 8th grade algebra programs, and you are going to sell your heart out. Doesn't make people bad, but it means that the way we think and talk and use expertise needs to be much more thoughtful. Fourth thing I've learned is that history matters. Not in the way that if we don't remember history, we're doomed to repeat it, blah, blah, blah. But much more prosaically, I wrote a paper years ago for the Democratic Leadership Council, Progressive Policy Institute, the old Clinton-Gore Democrats. This was like back in 2000, in which I said that teacher licensure was an anachronism, that seemed to me the better model for this stuff was like journalism and then the MBA, where it's a good thing to have, but prospective employers can interview anybody they want for a job. Well, I was at an ed school at the time. This was not well received. But the president of the American Association of College Teacher Ed was not thrilled with me at the National Press Club. He was like, dude, why is this guy at an ed school? And I spent about 6 or 8 months traveling around the country and speaking to groups and having relatively unproductive conversations because people who were in teacher preparation perceived this as hostile, as saying they were bad people. I finally, at some point, stumbled upon saying, look, you know what, let's remember how we got here. The reason we do teacher certification in this country is because teaching used to be a male profession in the early 1800s, when Horace Mann back in the 1830s and 1840s was worried about all these Catholic immigrants coming over. He wanted to build out these common schools where they could make them read the right Bible, the King James Bible, so that these Catholic kids would be better Americans than their parents. And he didn't have enough male labor to fill these schools. So they had to feminize the teaching profession because women were cheap and weren't going to go anywhere because no other options were open to them. But the men in charge didn't trust women around other people's children outside the home, so they needed to teach women the norms of interacting with other people's kids. So they set up these normal schools where they could certify that women had been trained by men in how to stand in front of classrooms and read the King James Bible. I'm like, look, I'm not saying that was a bad call. I'm not going to relitigate the 1840s. It's fine that they did it then. What I am saying today is that given our labor market, given that the average college grad has 4 to 5 jobs by the age of 30, given the challenges of actually keeping folks up to speed in terms of the skills and knowledge and pedagogies, I am not sure that one-stop licensure is a particularly good way. Now, people weren't any more likely to agree with me, but it was interesting that suddenly we were having conversations about how we got here, about labor market dynamics, about how do you get and keep and prepare good teachers rather than them feeling I was calling them bad guys and me feeling like, therefore, I was being portrayed as a bad guy. And this is, I think, the larger issue, that Look, we've been doing public education in this country in some form or other since Massachusetts Bay Colony did its first statute on this in 1647, right? We've been doing this work for 350 plus years. Schools have evolved in certain ways, pay schedules and job descriptions that don't necessarily have anything to do with how do you serve children well in 2017. Revisiting that, thinking about that, asking questions about that, ought not be a question of saying schools are failing. It ought to be an invitation to parents and communities and educators to rethink and reimagine what are the best ways to serve all of our kids. And I find that when you talk about it this way, it's much easier for the reform conversation to be one about how do we solve problems together rather than who's on the right and who's on the wrong side. Fifth and final thing I've learned is that passion can be a double-edged sword. Tim Murphy, who coaches the Harvard football team, who's won 8 Ivy League football titles, which is more or less impressive depending on how hard you think it is to win an Ivy League football title. But Murphy has a nice quote on this where he says, you know, the only way you can do this work is running 100 miles an hour with your hair on fire, which I think, in my experience, is a pretty good description for the way a lot of educators and education reformers tend to go about their work, especially the ones I respect most. Problem is, when you're running 100 miles an hour with your hair on fire, you tend not to be very aware of your surroundings. You tend not to be very thoughtful about your missteps and mistakes. And I think that's a real problem. You know, most of you in this room are probably familiar with the story Stone Soup, right? The old fable. 3 Revolutionary War soldiers are walking home from the war. They're walking through the woods of New England. It's winter. They're starving. They come upon a village. They knock on a door. They say, "Can you spare a little food?" The guy says no. They knock on 6, 7 more doors. Same answer. Next door, one of them says, "Let's try something different." He knocks on the door. He says, "Can we just borrow a pot?" The villager says, "Sure, I'll loan you a pot." Take this big pot, take it out to the middle of the village, build a fire under it, fill it with water, and then one of the 3 goes out, finds this big, handsome stone, drops it in the pot. One of the villagers whose doors they knocked on wanders out, says, "What are you guys doing?" They go, "We're making stone soup." He goes, "What stone soup?" They go, "It's awesome. We'll be happy to share it." He goes, "Great." They go, "The only thing is stone soup's best soup you've ever had, but it's even tastier with a little bit of carrot." Guy goes, "Oh, I got a dozen carrots. Let me go get them." While this is going on, somebody else walks by, says, "What's the commotion?" They go, "Same conversation." They say some potatoes, onions, venison. 6 hours later, they're all sitting around having this wonderful stew that everybody agrees is the best soup they ever had. Right? The moral of the story is that it wasn't the stone, it was everything else that the stone shook loose. This often feels like the parable of school improvement to me, right? The parable of school reform. Think about almost everything that anybody in our space has ever talked about has worked somewhere. Every pilot has been successful. And we say, aha, the stone must make a difference. But also think about what happens in those pilot experiments. It's usually at a school where the leadership wants to do it. Because you're choosing the place to do it, it's usually at a place where the faculty is on board. Frequently, these things are piloted at schools of choice, where families are actually excited about it. It's the pilot site, so whoever dreamed this thing up at whatever university is there to provide lots of tender, loving care. The foundation that's excited about it is putting in money to support the implementation. You get an MOU, a memorandum of understanding about things that get in the way. And then we find out that when you do all of this, that the reform works at its site. And people go, see, it works. They pick up the stone, and they go to carry it to another school, and then it doesn't work, and they go, it's an implementation problem. The doers didn't get it right. That's the way we think because we're running 100 miles an hour, and all we have time to do is stop for half a second, grab a stone that will solve this thing for us. Right? Maybe the problem is that schools are such fundamentally human institutions, so ultimately dependent on these judgments that are made in lots of subtle ways, that what really matters is whether or not you set things up in a fashion that allows the stone to be successful. But it's hard for us to think that way or see that way when we're as passionate as many of us are, because we want to solve problems for lots of kids today. And that requires that we get something big, that'll make a difference, that'll work, and not wait on all these subtle frustrations. Final thought, let me just close with this. It often seems, I think, in school reform, it often seems that good intentions and good ideas should count for a lot. I think one of the things that has most struck me over the years is that good intentions and good ideas count for a lot less than what you think they do. And judgment and wisdom and thoughtfulness count for a hell of a lot more. Let me stop there and we can have a conversation.
How do you get anything implemented without championing it? How do you get that done and I think this goes to your passion, it goes to the idea of blinders. How do you get anything implemented if you aren't going to champion it from the beginning with some enthusiasm?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. And so one of the things, it's funny, when I'm giving this talk, I realize, I think the book maybe less so, but the talk certainly, that people say, well, that's a real downer. And I don't actually think of it that way. One way to understand this is, look, there are whole swaths of the world, whole swaths of American life, where I wish people were much more passionate about what they do. I don't know, like airline customer service. Right? I wish people actually cared. In education, we have this unique challenge that we are inundated with people who are incredibly passionate about it, either because they're passionate about the work, or in many cases because they're passionate about this is a lever to create a better world in other ways. And so I think people are always going to champion the things they believe in. But I think we have an interesting problem, is that we've got folks who are so excited and so passionate that they wind up not going about the work in especially thoughtful or disciplined or effective ways. I always say, look, if you're training, if you're with the armed forces and you're training, Marines to take a beach, you could focus so much on the hoo-yah, gung-ho stuff that you've got a whole bunch of 19-year-olds running up a beach saying, I can take a bullet, and they get shot, and that's not a very successful strategy, right? What we want are physicians who are passionate about saving lives, but who are disciplined about making sure they understand exactly what they're doing and not rushing into the operation. And I think what we have in education, I don't want anybody to be less passionate about, and people will champion things regardless, whether I think they should or shouldn't. But I want is people who are going to champion them, thinking about why is it that parents aren't on board with me. So for instance, Merrill Tisch in New York, chairwoman of the Board of Regents, got very frustrated with the opt-out parents in New York State. They had 20% of families were not taking the test. And she said, don't they understand that this is good? These parents take their kids to the pediatrician. Kids don't like going to the pediatrician, but it's the right thing to do. Why don't parents get with the program? And I think what happens there is she got blinded by her passion. Because if you listen to that analogy, it actually suggests a big question. Because parents do take their kids to the pediatrician, do parents think of the New York State assessments as similar to taking the kid to the pediatrician? And they don't. And it turns out they don't for really good reasons. The pediatrician is not 10.5-hour visit. When parents take the kid to the pediatrician is giving them a diagnosis of their child right here and now. If something's not right, the pediatrician is telling that parent very straightforwardly, here's how you help your child get better. The New York State assessments, results were going to be mailed to parents 3 or 6 months later. The results were not actually geared towards helping those parents do better by their kids. They were intended to be part of a larger effort to focus on. So I think part of the problem is, there's nothing wrong with being a champion and being passionate, but there's an opportunity to be disciplined about our passion in a way that we listen more carefully, we're more reflective on how this plays out, we're more thoughtful about interacting with other folks who it's going to touch. And I think if we do that, I think that folks are going to find that the ideas they champion are going to have more staying power and be more effective in the long term than they would otherwise.
So the talkers and the doers, which most of us in this room, we are the doers, and we probably will always be the doers. And so what is one thing that we can leave this room and like our big takeaway from today, how to work effectively with the talkers? Because I think you hit it right on the head when it was like, this too shall pass, when we get in this rut of, it's just gonna change, so let's close our door on this and hope that this goes away in a year or two. So what is the takeaway that we can do as doers to work with these talkers?
Yeah. So if you want a really long and tedious response, I did a book on this a couple years ago called The Cage Busting Teacher, which is kind of a source. But let me put it this way. It's funny, when you talk this way to superintendents, they go, well, Rick, that's interesting, but look, I'm here. We're not going to do Reform of the Month. We're coming in and we're going to do Common Core implementation, and we're going to bring in aligned instructional approaches, and we are going to stick with them. I go, okay, but you understand that the teachers and principals in your system have heard 3 prior superintendents say that in the last 9 years. You are sincere about it, but that's not what they hear and not what they understand. And when you get offered this cool new job to be chancellor in New York in 3 years, you're going to feel sincere when you say it in New York, but a new superintendent will be standing in front of them. And part of the problem here is that when you talk to those superintendents, they go, yeah, but I'm a change maker. You know what my frustration is? So many of my principals aren't with the program. And the school board, they just won't get out of my way. I'm trying to do the right thing. Then when you talk to the principals in that same system, they'll tell you, you know, that superintendent is just getting in my way, them and Central with all their rules and regs. And not all my teachers are with the program, but by God, I am ready to make a difference for kids. And then when you sit down with the same teachers in that system, they'll tell you, man, my principal keeps getting in my way with their small persnickety BS. And not all my kids and parents are always supportive, but I am here fighting every day to do. We're all the hero of our own story. We're all the hero of the narrative. And so the best thing I think that teachers can do is to keep that in mind, because teachers are embedded in an asymmetric power relationship. When I wrote Cage Busting Leadership for Harvard, which Carol mentioned back in like 2012 or so, and one of the reasons I wrote that was because I kept talking to superintendents and principals and training them, and they would be much more interesting in the abstract than they were in their jobs, because there are all kinds of ways to use talent, to spend money, to serve kids that they thought were interesting, they didn't think they were allowed to do. Well, if you're a superintendent or principal, you have a fair bit of ability to do these things from your job. If you're a teacher, you lack that kind of what sociologists call positional authority. You don't have control over resources and stuff, so you very much have to be recognized that you're working uphill. And what happens is most teachers, they're not actually very good at this. Teachers tend to only spend about 4 or 5 hours a week at most working with adult colleagues as adults. So your typical teacher, your 30-year veteran teacher, can have the same kind of amount of experience working with teams of adults as like a 27-year-old, you know, dipstick at some like advocacy group. Just because they have not been afforded those opportunities. So when teachers do interact with their principal, it's amazing that principals have become teacher resistant, because 49 out of 50 times a teacher comes into their office, it's with a complaint or a demand, or I need this, or you've got to find $500 for those instructional materials, or you need to let, and principals have grown like an extra, you know, like an extra skin to just kind of that stuff bounce off. The way you as a teacher change that dynamic with a principal, and then later on with central and superintendent, is you actually signal that you understand how to work with them to solve problems for kids. So the first thing is you never walk in and you say, never say I need. You never say can I. You always walk in with an opportunity to do something better for kids. Hey, we're losing 6 minutes a day because we've got an undisciplined announcement schedule where we're having unpredictable interruptions of homeroom, and then again, I can't teach bell to bell 7th period because blah, blah, blah. So I've identified a problem that affects our learning opportunities for kids. Here is one proposed solution. I'm not telling you, boss, this is the solution, but here's one way we might deal with it. What do you think of that? How do we solve this together? Now, the interesting thing is, even if the principal tells you to get lost, tells you we're not going to do it, what happens is you have signaled to them that you understand how to manage up in an effective and constructive way. And if you do this 2 times, 3 times, you will find that principals are always hungry for people who operate this way, just like superintendents are always hungry to find school leaders who operate this way. And they will actually start to listen to you increasingly over time. So even if the first time or two doesn't work, by the end of year 1, you can change the nature of a relationship. And what happens is once you get flagged as the kind of person who knows how to operate this way, there's always a desperate shortage of people who get that and are problem solvers, and other doors will start to open up.
What is the role of philanthropy when it comes to public education or big foundation?
So I've done a couple books on this. I've thought about, a lot over the years. So partly it depends on your philosophy of involvement in the public space. My sense is I'm a Tocquevillian. And I'm like, look, I'm fine with people who want to give away their money, giving it away, trying to have an impact on public entities and public institutions. That's cool. That's part of it. That's how America works. Other people are less comfortable with that. But I start from there. And I'm like, look, none of us know what's going to work all the time. Even for me, I never know what's going to work. So this idea that people, shouldn't try things and shouldn't experiment is, I think, misguided. That said, I think, there's one real pathology with foundations that we need to take seriously, and one real back-end problem. The pathology, and again, if you read like my friend Diane Ravitch, she tends to talk about the folks who work at like Walton and Gates and Arnold Foundation, these guys, is that they're terrible people who are bent on doing terrible things to the nation's children, which I just think is ludicrous. I've been doing this stuff, like I said, for more than a quarter century. I've never sat down with somebody at the teachers' unions and actually had a beer and talked for an hour and not gotten up and thought, you know what, they think what they're doing is actually good stuff. I disagree with them profoundly on a lot of it. But in their mind, they go to bed sleeping well at night, that they're trying to help. And the exact same thing is true with the folks at these foundations. So if you think that the people who disagree with you on this stuff disagree because they're malicious and want to hurt kids and are evil, I think you're misguided. I think you are imputing motives that aren't there. That said, I think there is a pathology with foundations, which is that when you go to a foundation, nobody ever tells you you're full of stuff. Nobody ever tells you you're wrong. People suck up to you. They laugh at all your jokes. They want to talk about whatever you want to talk about because they want to be mission aligned to the grant priorities. When you don't hear things that people are saying because they're just not on point, nobody kind of calls you to account because nobody wants to pick fights with foundations. And it's exactly the same phenomenon that happens when you go to work for a governor, or especially go to work for the U.S. Department of Ed, is that at first you're aware of this, but over time you get so used to people sucking up to you that you just take it for granted, and that becomes the water you swim in. And it's a very rare person who can work in a high government position or at a foundation and not wind up having their worldview distorted by this. So what happens is foundations tend not to be very reflective, because it's not that they're not listening, but they're listening on their terms. They want to bring in their grantees and their strategic partners for deep conversations about evaluating the grant portfolio. But nobody's going to say, yeah, you don't know what the hell you're doing, and you're an idiot, because they're going to go, well, you might not be mission aligned. So people in these conversations there's a very particular kind of honesty that gets shared. And so I think that's a real problem. So foundations tend to live in bubbles of their own making until they decide they want to change direction. And then that brings us to the second problem, is for people in the real world, it feels like there's no accountability for the people in foundations. So Tom Vander Ark, when they launched the Gates Foundation back in '99, spent a year, listened very carefully, traveled the country, was thoughtful, talked to lots of people, came up with the priority that high schools are obsolete, and that we needed to create high schools that were rigorous and relationship-driven and relevant, which meant smaller high schools. And so the Gates Foundation spent tens or hundreds of millions, either creating small high schools or launching them. About 4 or 5 years downstream, they decided that that was a mistake. They pulled the plug. These schools were kind of left on their own, the educators and families, and Gates went on to do a new thing, which featured for a couple of years Oprah wearing a yellow wristband about stand up for education. And then they went on to, the measures of effective teaching stuff. And nobody, if you're looking from the outside, you're like, well, wait a minute. The foundations tell us that we're not doing our job. They tell us we need to be held accountable. Who's holding them accountable for when their ideas don't play out? When do they actually get called to the carpet? And that's actually, I think, a reality, is that part of the ferociousness in the fight about the role of foundations is there's a real sense, I think, among a lot of the doers and even a lot of the people in these communities that talk of accountability and responsibility is entirely a one-way street. And I think that's a place, I think foundations can figure out ways to try to control some of the natural pathology of getting caught in your bubble, and they should. And I think they need to try to do more to show that they are holding themselves and their employees responsible and accountable for the decisions that they make.